Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Taiwan Internet Governance Forum. Following, we have panel discussion, session number 14, delving into the topic of protective measures for Internet governance in an increasingly fractured world. Please allow me to introduce our two moderators for the session. Mr. Pablo Hinojosa, Strategy Engagement Director of APNIC. And Ms. Manju Chen, Assistant Manager of NII. Joining us on site, please let me introduce Ms. Anriette Esterhuysen, Executive Director of Association for Progressive Communications. Mr. William Drake, Director of International Studies, Columbia Institute for Tele-Information. And Dr. Rebecca Fan, Senior Research Fellow of NSTC Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology. Joining us virtually, we have three panelists who are also contributing to our discussion from afar. Ms. Madeline Carr, Mr. Dennis Broeders, and Mr. Akinori Maemura. Can Ms. Carr, Mr. Broeders, and Mr. Maemura hear us?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, clearly.
Okay, great. I'll now hand the
can
floor.
You hear us?
I can hear something very far in the distance, but that's what I got.
We will do our best, Dennis. Thank you. All right.
Okay, I'll hand the floor to the moderators.
Thank you very much. Madeline, would you like to kickstart this? Welcome.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, and thanks to everyone who is here today, particularly to the speakers and participants who've been working on this session with us over the past few weeks. We're really grateful to the Taiwan IGF for accepting this proposal and for allowing us to have this discussion in this forum. We have a long history of bringing these conversations to the IGF. And really, it's been over the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years, Pablo and I, together with two colleagues, Duncan Hollis and Louise Marie Hural, neither of whom I think are here today, have been bringing these conversations about cyber norms to the IGF since about 2016, I think it is. And when we have done that, we have really worked hard to involve not just the policy community, but really to bring the technical community into those conversations, and in a way that we can try and bridge that gap. So rather than having people sort of side by side in these discussions, we've put a lot of work into trying to, I guess, kind of choreograph a conversation that helps develop an understanding between the technical community and the policy community on cyber norms, and we've had quite a bit of success with that. The way we tend to run these sessions is in a kind of a fast-paced way where we bring in particular interventions. We always try and get a good coverage of different perspectives, and we do it in a way that we hope delivers a kind of really thought-provoking dialogue. For us, these sessions are more about questions and answers. So it's not the ambition of today for us is not necessarily to arrive at an answer to what we feel is quite a challenging question, but it's to really provoke that kind of discussion that takes us at least some way from the kind of status quo thinking to kind of feel around there with our colleagues to see if there's anything out there that we can build upon for future discussion. So very, very challenging question that we've brought this year. So thanks again to the Taiwanese Internet Governance Forum and to everyone for being here. I don't want to take up any more time in this session. I hand over to Pablo now.
Madeleine, thank you. It's really good to have you here remotely. We have had a few problems with joining remote participants, so we are still under a bit of stress, but this is fantastic, and thank you so much, Kuwe Wu and TWIGF for accepting this workshop. We submitted this workshop proposal to the Global IGF, and it didn't make it to the program. And perhaps because it is a little bit of a polemic thing, and I'm very, very happy to have such a star lineup of speakers to discuss positive protective measures for internet governance, and in particularly for the public core. Dennis, who is on my phone, will try to talk a little bit about the public core of the internet, but during recent years, there has been this discussion about states and multilateral organizations in this cyber norm that Madeleine was talking about, certain agreement about not interfering with the public core. And these are mostly norms set in negative terms, something that states must respect in terms of leaving on their own these infrastructure services and multi-stakeholder processes that flourish better in a private multi-stakeholder unregulated sector. So this workshop, the aim of it is to explore whether there could be positive protective measures that can be put in place to future-proof the public core. Can states or the multilateral arena offer some protective measures of the multi-stakeholder model to succeed? And it's a genuine question, and it's a tricky question, because usually the tech community and others might fall into the automatic answer of no way, no. However, this is about sort of opening it with some ingenuity and try to see if something would happen, what shape or form would that take? So that's a little bit sort of the question, as Madeleine talked about. We're not looking for answering all of it, but it's just opening a dialogue or a debate. In terms of rules of engagement, Manju, would you like to talk a bit about them?
Yes, thank you very much, Pablo. Hello, everyone. My name's Manju. I'm the third moderator for this session. I'm actually here as a ignorant kind of interrupter when people are speaking things in too hard ways. When I don't understand, I'll be like, can you explain? Wait a minute. Please explain. What are the acronyms you were just using? What is the full name of it? So please, people, don't use acronyms. Use it in the full name. And please don't give us, philosophical, very higher up. We don't understand what you're talking about, those kind of, or this, oh, we've talked about this 10 years ago. You know what I'm talking about, those kind of comments. We will be interrogating you if you are making those kind of comments. So we're also hoping to have meaningful contribution to the Global Digital Compact. I'm sure it's going to be introduced later by one of the speakers. And please also, I know some people are not from Taiwan on our panel, so I'm going to be the one who's from Taiwan. And when you're talking about something that we probably won't have more idea in Taiwan, we'll be like, but how does it connect to Taiwan? After all, we are in Taiwanese IGF, right? So that will be our rules of engagement. No kind of, we've talked about this. You know what I'm saying, those kind of comments. In short, and I don't want to swear, but no bullshit. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I ask a question in the light of what you've just said? What are cyber norms?
Well,
how do you know everyone has the common understanding of what cyber norms are?
That's an answer that actually you are scheduled to give after Dennis. Dennis, I will do my best for your voice to come out clearly. And before we get into the norms aspect of things, I would like Dennis, because he is actually the mastermind behind the concept of the public core. So Dennis, could you explain to the audience sort of your work, your research, and why it is important?
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Is it coming through or not?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I can't even be there virtually. So people behind the scenes are trying to make it work, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. Blame WebEx. So my name is Broeders. I'm now a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I wrote a short book, a report for the Scientific Council for Government Policy, which is a think tank in the Netherlands, when I was working there in 2015, called The Public Core of the Internet. And in that, we formulate the protection of the public core of the Internet as a norm of restraint for states. And so this has already been said, but the aim of the norm was to protect the Internet as a global public good by establishing sort of an international standard that stipulates that the Internet public core, and then we're talking about its main protocols, its core protocols and infrastructure, which can be considered a global public good, must be safeguarded against unwarranted intervention by governance. So very much a negative norm. One of the other key recommendations of this report, and I wanted to flag that, is that states should try to disentangle internet security and national security. And so states should try to make sure that the logic of national security does not overpower the logic of internet security and all the institutions and trust relationships that support that governance model. Pablo asked me to also say a little bit on what it's built on. So it's built on the work of many, like all academic work, but I think there's two people who deserve a special mention. That's Laura Denardis and Ron Diebert, especially because those are people who understand sort of the underlying technology of the internet, understand the multi-stakeholder internet governance framework, and they're also people who really understand national security and geopolitics. And in 2015, those two worlds were coming closer and closer together, and I think now they are very much on top of each other, or at least in a Venn diagram. So, as we've seen since 2015, so a lot of state actors, but also non-state actors, they've been discussing the concept, developing proposals on state behavior and the protection of the public core. So the Dutch government was one of the first to pick it up. Then very significantly, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, published a norm on the issue. Anriette will talk about that later. It has found its way into multi-stakeholder documents such as the Paris Call for Trust and Security. It's found its way into EU policy, especially EU Cybersecurity Act and the NIS2 directive. And in both of those, so the protection of public core figures, and I think in the EU Security Act, they name a few specific protocols like DNS and IPv6, etc. In the NIS directive, very much in line with current geopolitical developments, they explicitly talk about subsea cables. So, yeah, they sort of pick and choose. Then in the open-ended working group and in the UN GDE negotiations, they came out with reports in 2021. And disclaimer, I was on the Dutch delegation for both of these processes. So both of these reports link the protection of the public core to existing norms on the protection of critical infrastructure. And that is significant because at that point, especially with the the like-minded states, they had two mantras. One was no new norms, and the other was we need to add a layer of understanding to the 11 norms of the 2015 report. And to some extent that was okay, but to some extent that also meant that we were trying to push round pegs into square holes. Also significant in the open-ended working group report, am I still being followed? Is that still okay?
Yes, it is very okay, Dennis.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll just continue. So So the language in both of these reports is so the need to protect all critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure, supporting essential services to the public, along with endeavoring to ensure the general availability and integrity of the internet. So ensuring the general availability and integrity of the internet, that is sort of the long translation of this norm into now UN language. What they also underlined, which was interesting, is that they said, okay, such infrastructure now includes infrastructure that provides services across several states. So to a certain extent, they have now seen the idea that internet infrastructure is not just national infrastructure, but it's also something that works across borders. To most people, especially in the community that we're speaking now, that is a bit of a duh. I mean, that's quite obvious. For states, it was a huge thing because they are very jealously guarding the idea of what criticality is and what is within their sovereign rights to do. So for diplomats, this was a bit of a jump. Interestingly enough, and perhaps we can come back to that later, you also see that once such an idea is out there, you also see that states try to appropriate it in a way that is not so great. So Russia has been floating proposals in the ITU using the language of the public core of the internet, but framing it in such a way that it fits in line with two of their biggest wishes: one, to have a treaty on internet security, and the other one, to take away more and more of the administration of the internet away from the multi-stakeholder community and towards a more multilateral solution. And so literally quoting from the ITU proposal, it is states that must act as the guarantors of the stability and the integrity of the public core, which is interesting because the original thinking was, of course, a norm of restraint for states. So there's definitely also a slight risk in talking about positive obligations. Also, Chinese scholars have been working to sort of reinterpret the public core to make it fit more with their idea of sovereignty. I heard Pablo, so that's probably a good cue for me to stop here, right?
Thank you, Dennis. Really, this is a good intro. There are many concepts there. The public core, the normative process, the United Nations, a group of governmental experts processes, and what has happened around it. What is important to know is that Dennis, who is the mastermind behind this, put forward working term that is useful to refer to a series of services, infrastructures, protocols, and we are using that concept in order to understand whether there could be protective measures and how they would look like. Now, Anriette was thinking about the need to start with what are these cyber norms, and I will let you do that because you were also involved in the cyber norm about protecting the public core.
Thanks, Pablo. The reason I asked that is because I think it took me a long time to figure out what that means. And I mean, essentially, norms, I think we all understand. Cyber norms are difficult to understand because there's no concise or common definition of what cyberspace is. And I mean, the idea is that cyber norms are norms that apply to cyberspace. And it has this connection with cybersecurity, the militarization of cyberspace. It's connected to the GGE. And so, in fact, I think it's quite complex in some ways. Cyber norms are not all that, they're not like all that finite, but essentially that's what they are. They are norms that have emerged in this context of looking at what happens in cyberspace, and particularly how states relate to one another in terms of cybersecurity, cyber defense, and cyber offense. I think Dennis's work was really profound. So I'll just give where I pick up on the story. I actually heard Dennis, I don't even remember, but even before I was appointed as a commissioner of the Global Commission on Cyberspace, I'd heard Dennis speak about the public core, and I'd identified very strongly with that at the time because I felt that one of the things that's missing in internet governance is sufficient common understanding of the publicness of the internet. And I think that remains a challenge. And I think what Dennis did and why his work was so productive is that he made the discussion more specific. He talked about the public core and the publicness of the public core, which is much more easier to define and discuss and put borders around than the notion of the publicness of the internet, which is a much more contested and unclear concept. But two things happened. So we had Dennis's work, and then in 2015, the group of governmental experts, that's the UN First Committee group, where states came together to talk about international cybersecurity. So this is very different from national cybersecurity and national cyber resilience strategies. It's really much more about what happens between states. And there was a period of real anxiety around that, and I think particularly for small countries, because countries like the US, China, the Russian Federation, and others were investing enormously in cyber military capacity. And for smaller countries without similar capacity, that is very destabilizing. So there was a need to try and create some kind of behavioral rules. The GGE did that, and in 2011, the GGE actually produced some quite decent norms on responsible state behavior. So these group of governmental norms were created, and they kind of just sat there. No one did anything with them. And then when the GGE met again, they failed to reach consensus, particularly around how to interpret the application of international humanitarian law, which I had to learn at the time equals the war of law. To a large extent, how that applies in cyberspace. So this commission was then formed. It was initiated and supported by the Dutch government. It was a multi-stakeholder commission, and it came up with a broad mandate, which was to try and fill this gap that was left by governments within the UN system being unable to continue the conversation. And one of the things we tried to do was develop some norms that built on the 2011 norms, but also because we were multi-stakeholder, we wanted our norms to be multi-stakeholder and provide guidance to different stakeholder groups. And the first norm that we worked on, which was inspired by Dennis's work, is the norm on the protection of the public core. And in fact, it wasn't just a negative norm. I mean, the norm itself reads as follows. I'll just read it. It's very short. State and non-state actors should neither conduct nor knowingly allow activity that intentionally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet, and therefore the stability of cyberspace. Dennis has already mentioned how we defined it. And we defined it and we linked this to a call to protect. So we used the norm, the negative norm that says don't do this, and we linked that to a call which was to say do this, protect this core. And we defined it, and I won't go on. I think Dennis covered it, but we looked at both the packet routing system, the naming and numbering systems, some of the cryptographic mechanisms of security and identity, which we feel is also very important from a human rights perspective as well as from a security perspective. And then also, as Dennis said, the physical transmission. And I think I'll leave it at that. Dennis has already mentioned how this norm was quite successful in some places, but then also abused by the Russian Federation and forced us to then make a disclaimer to subtly correct the rather unsubtle distortion of the language of our norm.
Sorry, Pablo, I know we are on like very tight schedule in the sense that everybody has short time for their perspectives. But actually, I think, Anna, you were saying that it's easy to understand what norm is, but not what cyber norm is. I find it actually difficult because, remember, I'm playing dumb today. It's difficult to even understand what norm is. What do you mean by norm? Is it the same as rules? Is it regulation? Is best practice? What does norm mean? Why are we using this instead of any other sounds like similar meaning words?
I think that's a really, I have my own, that's such a good question. And in fact, in 2017, myself, my organization did some work with Madeline, among others, where we convened an event, a pre-event in 2017, just prior to the IGF, where we started looking at how one can put cybersecurity on we actually called it putting cybersecurity on the rights track. And in the process, I think, what we found is that it's, human rights norms, for example, what are they? They are norms that are sometimes part of laws. There are international UN human rights standards. In Taiwan, you have you have commitments. You have laws that protect human rights. So human rights norms exist formally, informally, nationally, internationally, and regionally. So the idea of norms really is that they are pre-laws. They can be formal, they can be binding, they can be non-binding. There are rules, but they can sometimes also just be values. So it is a fairly open-ended term. Customary norms you have as well. And that's why we found it's actually quite a useful term to use when you're still trying to build an approach. And what we felt with cybersecurity is that, as Dennis said in his introduction, that cybersecurity, pre all of this work that we all did, was purely about national security. And it was extremely difficult to have a conversation with government that looked at the security of people, the security of journalists, the security of information. And I think by using this language of norms and bringing in the language of human rights norms, open governance norms, democratic norms, and mixing that with the language of cyber and security norms, we were able to open that conversation up a little bit.
Thank you very much, Anriette. I think Rebecca is like, she's ready to jump in. She couldn't resist in participating in this. And she, of course, we really wanted her to be on this panel. She was kind of resistant in her first place, but we kind of forced her into joining us. But we are super happy to have her, and I think she will, of course, build on what we have been discussing and provide a very fresh and newly, because she wasn't in this discussion when people were having it, and we really loved her fresh perspectives when we were having pre-discussion about this. Please, Rebecca.
Okay, right. Can you hear my voice all right? Okay, I have to speak closely to the mic, all right. So I've been given the role or task, rather, of adding a different dimensions to the dialogue. So now I'd like to take you on an interdisciplinary journey to visit other arenas or fields and how they approach the governance question. Let's see if we can draw some inspiration or insights for the cyberspace debates. In particular, I will be drawing references from two of my previous research projects. One is on international human rights law and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the other one was a project on communal data sharing and commenting in the digital context. So one of the hot topics emerged in the process of Anriette, that is the UN Declaration of Rights for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UN, they love these long acronyms. So one of the hot topics emerging in that process was human and genetic resources. This topic alone invoked more than 60 years of international efforts. Sorry, this is not the slide yet, but you can leave it there for now. One of the hot topics emerged, which we are referring to this international convention. And this topic really took the international community a long time and a lot of efforts on the question of how to govern this type of materials. And broadly construed, there are 5 major approaches to governing genetic resources, or GR, ranging from open access, state sovereign rights, intellectual property rights, the universal scheme of the common heritage of mankind, and mixed systems of the above. Now, the massively expanded scope of genetic resources governance over the years has generated new issues from conservation, food security, climate change adaptation or mitigation, to protection of human rights. while the most developed area is the exchange of plant genetic resources, the least developed areas are the governance of human and microbial GR, genetic resources. For example, the leading instrument, that is this one, known as the CBD, which stands for the Convention on Biological Diversity, adopted in 1992 and enforced in 1993, it specifically excluded human genetic resources from its scope. Same as the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources, the fair and equitable sharing of benefit arising from the utilization to the CBD. My God, such a long acronym. While they present their scope that way, the trade agreement known as TRIPS, that is the agreement on trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights administered by the World Trade Organization and facilitated by the World Intellectual Property Organization, they remained silent on this topic and failed to exclude patentability of genes and naturally occurring genetic materials from its scope. For human and genetic resources and the question about ownership and control, there is not yet an established international approach as of yet. Nevertheless, there are sort of norms that the UNESCO declaration or principles kind of provided. UNESCO stands for UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. That include, namely, the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, the International Declaration on Human Genetic Data, and the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Now, UNDRIP, that is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the latest addition to this line of soft law or international instruments on governing human and genetic resources. So among the aforementioned approach of governance, I was most curious about the notion of common heritage of mankind. Now the slide can go to the next page. Then this notion of, next slide please. The notion of common heritage of mankind actually emerged into the international arena concerning the law of the sea since the 1960s, and later about our planet's genetic resources, among others. Now, in this quote that I put on the slide, the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we usually call the UNCLOS, stated in its preamble, quote, the area of the seabed and ocean floor and the sea subsoil thereof, beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, as well as the resources are the common heritage of mankind, the exploration and exploitation of which shall be carried out for the benefit of mankind as a whole, irrespective of the geographical location of states. This concept of common heritage of mankind was a governing principle specified in the Article 136 in this convention. It was reiterated throughout the convention. An earlier instrument that already enshrined this notion was the, please next slide, was another instrument called the International Undertaking on Planet Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. We usually call it IU, it's by the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, another specialized agency of the UN. It was first adopted by governments at the FAO of the UN, and then, it was in 1981. But there's a long process because the multi-stakeholder and the multi-actors, state, non-governmental organizations, and so on, and it's a drawn-out process, and finally reached some sort of agreement in 2001. This process represents some international effort to protect genetic resources from privatization by establishing their status as the common heritage of mankind. The reason why I bring this up is because, how should I put it? Because there's a historical moment or paradigm shift from this type of approach of governing genetic resources to the CBD adopted a decade later that actually move away from this open access or common heritage of mankind kind of notion. And what the CBD did was not only move away from the idea of common heritage and open access, it also shifted to conditional access based on national sovereignty over natural resources. I know my time is probably up, but the thing that I want to reflect on is how should I bring it back in? Because I probably used up my 6 minutes, correct?
That we're not alone in terms of the problem statement of things to protect, right?
Yeah. Because if if it's just a minute to link back to the cyberspace and the internet, it could be helpful to tease out a bit of the question of protecting what and for whom. Is it that whatever thing that we're protecting a structure, institute, a community, or a way of being in the world? And who are the vulnerable groups in the cyberspace landscape or ecosystem? It's just open up some questions for consideration or debate, if that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Very helpful to think wide before we go more into grounding this discussion. And I will ask Bill, sort of how do you see these related to internet governance evolution and the Global Digital Compact in the sense of the things that are trendy and processes that are happening?
Thanks. I will actually go in a little bit different direction for some of this. First, I'll start out by saying, because you asked about cyber norms. Cyber norms is an appropriation of the term norm by the national security community that has decided that when one talks about the internet, all one means is national security. There are, in fact, norms internationally in all kinds of different international issue areas pertaining to the internet, whether it's intellectual property, content, whatever else, but somehow people in national security decided that the cyber meant security, and therefore, when we say cyber norms, we refer to security. It's something that I think is problematic because, in fact, norms are an essential part of the definition of the Working Group on Internet Governance adopted for the definition of Internet governance that was adopted by the World Summit of the Information Society and it's been cited by governments and other stakeholders for ever since 2005. I know this because I led the team that drafted it. It was drawn from the political science definition of international regimes. Norms are a part of that, and they're different from principles and rules. If I had time, I'd explain, but I don't. Nevertheless, I would say that norms can be both prescriptive and proscriptive. Prescriptive means that you're saying that something should be done. Proscriptive means something should not be done. Norms are broad statements of obligations to do something or not do something, and they are widespread across the internet landscape, not just in national security. That said, I think it's important and interesting that you're asking a question about positive prescriptions here, because often when people talk about norms, they tend to focus only on proscriptive norms, that's to say restrictions. People tend to think of norms as simply something that limits behavior. But indeed, norms often encourage behavior, and that's essential. And that has a long-standing history in international communications. It is in particular very relevant in international telecom. And there's a reason to mention international telecom, and this goes back to Dennis's comment at the outset that the Russians trying to appropriate the term public core was potentially problematic. Yeah, it is potentially problematic. And the reason it's problematic is because there's been a long struggle on the part of governments and the telecom industry to claim that the internet is telecommunications and should be subject to international telecom rules. Let's talk about positive prescriptions, positive measures for protection of networks in international telecom. It goes back to the beginning, 1850, the Treaty of Dresden, which was the first multilateral agreement setting out rules of the game for telecommunications pertaining to telegraph for countries. It set up rules that required states to inform each other of who was authenticated members of the network, how they were communicating, how they would divide their resources and money, how they handled the charging, inform each other of any irregularities, and so on. So it set up positive obligations for states to notify each other of any malfunctions, problems, or other issues pertaining to telecom. That has been in every international telecom instrument for the past century and a half. The International Radio Telegraph Convention that was adopted in Berlin in 1906 similarly did the same thing. States affirmatively took on the obligation to take steps to avoid harm to the public infrastructure, services, and communications of other nations, including the avoidance of harmful interference and setting rules on the conduct of jamming. Network facilities were to have trusted identities, and these were to be shared among governments who would ensure interoperability between the different systems and so on. There would be emergency capabilities identified, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole set of requirements established for international radio communications by governments of a positive prescriptive nature to protect networks. In telecom more generally, in 1988, we had the adoption of new international telecommunications regulations. This set out important requirements that, for one thing, allowed the internet to take off, because it set up, for the first time, a recognition that special arrangements could be entered into by entities based in different countries that did not impact the other players. This was a means of allowing people to create private networks outside the realm of interstate public telecommunications done through national telecom administrations. And part of this was a recognition that every government was to ensure that other governments, in allowing special arrangements, would act to avoid technical harm to the networks of third parties. So you have an affirmative responsibility under international telecom law, which pertains to all states, because everybody's a signatory of this now, that you shall ensure that there shall be no damage caused to the networks of other countries by things you allow to happen within your own country. And this has been a subject of huge controversy also, because they tried to include in that the notion of economic as opposed to technical harm, because the states, the monopolies, were looking to ensure that nobody would establish private networks that would take away revenue from them. And they had a big fight over that and finally said, okay, we can't agree on that, but we will have only a requirement for technical harm to be prohibited. So this has been an issue ever since. When the internet took off, the IP-based internet, it was not recognized as being implicated by this. The provisions that were put in place were generally thought to pertain to things like open systems interconnection-based networks, system network architecture of IBM, public data networks, and so on. But, and this is getting to the main point then, there is a continuing fight over this question, because governments have been insisting, Russia, China, and others, that the internet is telecommunications under international law, that the internet must be declared to be fully within the scope of the definition of telecom in the International Convention, the International Telecommunication Union's Convention, Constitution, and regulations. If you have a situation where the internet is deemed to be telecom and is subject to all the obligations that states have entered into to each other to avoid damage to the telecom network, then you have a risk. So, to conclude, be careful what you ask for. If you open the door to governments taking measures to so-called protect the public core, I assure you that what the Russians have been trying to push for decades in the ITU will get more support, and you will be dealing with that.
Okay, so I guess we had heard a lot of examples. We heard examples of, biology and, common humankind heritage, and we heard the example of telecommunication. And I think you were saying it's dangerous if you see internet as telecom. And I'll ask why? Because coming from outside, I wouldn't know why it's different, because it feels like it's the same. It makes us communicate with each other, right? So why is it okay to regulate Telegram, and they're all good examples when you put in positive measures. When it comes to internet, certainly it's not. But that's my question, and I have failed miserably of managing the time. I didn't interrupt for my first speaker, and I felt bad if I started to do to the second speaker and then the third, and then so we just continue to delay. But I'll keep Akinori because I know you the best from the panelists. So I'm gonna keep you on a very tight time schedule. I'm sorry if we cut you off in 6 minutes, but here we go.
Thank you very much, Manju. Thank you very much, all the colleagues of the panelists. It is really, stimulating discussion. And then the business intervention is quite clear from the international relationship and the telecom regulation. I totally agree with the bill that it's the international telecommunication is so strictly defined, and then if the internet should be strictly aligned with that regulation, that we have a lot of complicated scenarios, then we need to be careful about that. With that, the internet is driven by the multi-stakeholder policy making, and then that is quite true. For example, I was long involved in the APNIC process and the ICANN process, and then where we see is the people getting the IP address is bound by the contract with for example, APNIC and the ISPs. And then there's a policy development process in APNIC, and then the APNIC has the contract with the ICANN, all of the public contractual relationship, and then that is regulating the behavior of the internet. So inherently the internet is not regulated by the government. And then that is a little bit different from the domestic telecommunication is certainly regulated by the government. So we the internet people are trying very hard to be independent from the national jurisdictions, but we need to take care of the very good balance. So these days, I'd like to talk about this session's theme is to protect the public core and how we can do that. And then it is a really interesting area that the internet which is run by the quite of the public sectors operation of the ISPs and the infrastructure, and then how the government can be intervened into such a private activity. So I hope that we have a very good way forward to have the good harmonization between the private and the public, the control into a very good shape. Then in case of the ROIR, we these days have a little bit of difficulty. For example, in the Russian Russia going to the Ukraine problem, RIPE-NCC had some influence from the sanction by the EU to the Russia. In that time, the RIPE-NCC had some.
Sorry, Akinori. What is RIPE-NCC and what is RIR?
RIPE-NCC, the European regional interterritorial. Is that correct? Answering your question?
Yes, and what do they do?
They do the task of the APNIC is doing in this region. Administering the IP address and making the policy for that by the open the bottom-up process. That's answering your question, Manju?
Yes, thank you very much. You can continue with Russian invading Ukraine, and there was sanction problems, and you have still 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. And then you consume the 30 minutes by this, 30 seconds by this. But anyway, my point is that such, coordination body of the internet, which is the private collaboration, is now have the influence from the sanction, and then the sanction needs to, restrict the provision of the economic assets to the targeted countries. Then IP address provision was that some of them are regarded as such a provision. But internet coordination is not like that. But maybe we need to maintain that not influenced by the one country's jurisdiction, but it is maintained as the neutral body to maintain the internet, global internet infrastructure. So this is the another agenda for us, the internet and the society, to have make a good balance between the public regulation and the restriction, and then private sector coordination for the running the internet. So that is my my kind of question to put along with this public core protection kind of discussion. Because I think it has a lot of similarity between them. Thank you very much.
You did a very good time management. It's exactly, well, it's 10 minutes, 10 seconds plus 6 minutes, but I cut you off in the middle. So you did a good job. And now we're going to the questions from the floor. I see already 2 people standing in front of the mic. We can just start right off, please.
Hello. Okay. Kenny Huang, Chair of APNIC and TWNIC. And just a few comments regarding to the discussion so far. And basically, first of all, we probably mix up the multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism. And because the major concept between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism is the key compared to internet governance community versus the other different, like UN, their operation. Second, and the global cybersecurity never been reached by multilateralism because the nature, different state nature, they are competing each other, especially cybersecurity has been weaponized by the state defense department. So they are competing each other. How can you looking for cybersecurity from state cooperation? The third, and we just have a Pablo can mention a little bit. Internet governance community just launched a declaration say, internet community is a technical community, it's not civil society at all. That means the internet community has, we have our own policy making process, we have our multi-stakeholder bottom-up decision-making process, and we have our policy enforcement process from some point of view. We are individual sovereignty at all. So how can we working with the system like a UN versus internet governance community? So basically that's a totally different idea, concept between the multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Anyone wants to comment on it?
I think actually, you know, the Kenny's mentioned about, you know, that area of that. I tried to go into a particular case. We know that ethnic in trouble for several years, more than 2 years. This is a kind of multi-stakeholderism is kind of failure. Or, you know, what is the eventually the impact to this multi-stakeholderism? You know, I think although this is ethnics going to the court, and court eventually coming out the receiver and the statement. And Anriette, you are in that region, you know that. It's so critical. You know, we know the IP address is so critical the ethnic is so important for this the stability of the internet, particularly in the Africa continent. And is there any way in this, this panel we can talking about how we remedy to help to go through this difficult time?
Thank you. We have another question. I guess we just get questions and
I will do a short one.
Of course. Thank you very much.
My comment or question is actually a little simpler. This is not as practical as what the previous people have been asked, but when I'm hearing all these different opinions or the mechanism that's been working, I keep thinking that even though within each organization or affiliation that we say that we have been practicing multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, and trying to reach some kind of goal. And I believe ultimately the goals are very similar. We're trying to get to a better place, a bigger heart where we can reach to serve more and utilize the internet governance where we are here now, trying to working together. So the key for cooperation or collaboration is actually what I've been thinking, that whether that's really the thing that can glue people together from the different society, from the different organization, or the various of the multi-stakeholder, bottom up, coming all together to this whole goal that we can working together, because we couldn't really afford the redundancy or the duplication happen between one to the other. And that's just a few thoughts for you to share. Thank you.
One more comment, and then we start to wrap up. Wait, is it okay if I extend for 7 or 8 minutes afterwards?
We have 10 minutes for break. If people want to skip the coffee break, I'm okay, fine.
All right, so let's speed this up. Okay. Last comment from the floor, and then we go back to try to ground this.
我叫孟宏福，我是来自网中智库。因为我的问题是针对各位嘉宾，所以我会用英文提问。Good day, my name is Meng Hongfu. I'm from Net Talent, a think tank based in Taiwan, which is a subsidiary to Net Chinese, and I can accredited registrar. And I want to start off with a thank you to Pablo for letting me know of the session and inviting me to make a comment. And my question is to the panelists and our dear guests. I'm a CSAM processor, and CSAM stands for Child Sexual Abuse Material. So my duty is to remove these materials from the internet. And my question to you is, how can we bring laws, regulations, the public sector, and the public court together to a common ground to enable CSAM processing on the internet and globally? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just taking stock very quickly, right? We are in an increasingly fragmented space in geopolitics and also on the internet. We are asking a genuine question. How can we protect the public core? We talked about the whole normative process, UN, proscriptive, prescriptive. We also took ideas from other fields, genetics, seabed, human and vulnerable groups. We then go into sort of some history and evolution from the history of coordination of telecommunications regulation. We went into sort of issues that are happening in the internet space, which is very different from the geopolitical space, for example, at the UN. As Kenny mentioned, there are different mindsets. One is collaborative, the other is competitive. So how can we sort of ground this discussion in terms of, are there any collaborative measures between the two different mindsets, using the strengths that each one has? Some has more legitimacy and sovereignty, another has more ability to run and operate things. So let's just do one more round quickly to take stock from the experts and try to sort of conclude, probably with more questions than answers, but then this will be a cliffhanger kind of finish to the event, so there needs to be continuity. Anriette, you had some views.
Thank you, Pablo. Well, Pablo, firstly, I don't personally agree that we have an increasingly fragmented world. I think parts are fragmented and parts are not. I think there's the China-Taiwan situation, but there are other areas where there's more cooperation. In fact, for example, African states, BRICS, new BRICS. BRICS is now a new bloc. We might not like that bloc, you might not agree with it, but it's a new form of global South cooperation. I think the world is complex, and I think that you see different configurations of fragmentation and collaboration. Look at gender as well, but I won't dwell on that. I just think don't make the assumption, base the assumption on evidence. I think what brings it together really is that, and this is also, I think, what is the bottleneck, the stumbling block, is public interest and how we understand it and how we define it. If you look at the ICANN bylaws, you will find the concept of public interest there. If you look at many human rights norms, you find that there as well. But somehow, so when Bill talks about, and when many North Americans talk about public interest, they automatically assume that means public as in government. And I think we need to, no, I don't, okay, you didn't say that, sorry, but many people do. I know you don't particularly say that. So I think what we need to look at is, what do we want good multilateral governance to achieve? What do we want good multi-stakeholder governance to achieve? And other forms of governance, and be specific and drive towards that. So legitimacy shouldn't be
governance situation.
And legitimacy shouldn't be established based on whether you are multilateral or multi-stakeholder. Legitimacy, sorry, my English is failing me, it's not my first language, it should be based on how effective you are, how inclusive, how transparent, how accountable.
Awesome.
So
Dennis.
I think I want to just continue with this. I think that the issue of going forward, and to respond to the AfriNIC question, which was addressed to me, I think we need to respond to these challenges by evolving our stakeholder or our whatever governance mechanisms. The AfriNIC case is an example of a failure to protect the public core. In this case, the numbering system. It's a failure that is a failure of the multi-stakeholder numbering organization system. But then resorting to multilateral mechanisms to fix that would probably just amplify that failure. So I think what we need to do is, how do we adapt, how do we evolve, how do we strengthen our governance mechanisms in order to make them more effective.
Thank you. Dennis?
Yeah, still here. I wasn't able to follow everything, so I have a few limited comments. So one of the things that Rebecca talked about that struck me, sort of the common heritage of mankind, and there is overlaps in that thinking. I remember when I was in New York for WSIS Plus 10, when the public core was just out, the representative from Malta was the one who picked it up and connected it to the idea of common heritage of mankind. So there are Wahlverwandtschaften, there are places where these terminologies overlap. Maybe also something about publicness. So one of the continuing discussions I have about the public core of the internet is that some people interpret the public as being, oh, it has to be done by public authorities, which is of course not the idea. It comes from global public goods, which can be made by any actor, state, non-state, or multi-stakeholder. But that is one element also where you see that language matters. And maybe the last point to pick up on is Bill's point on sort of the multilateralism and the move towards telecommunication. I think it's very important that we realize that is going on, and also from the multi-stakeholder community, sort of make sure you inform the representatives at the national level to make sure they are aware of what that actually means in terms of protecting the public core of the internet. And this is something to be aware of, but we have to go through also state representatives to make sure that that message comes across.
Thank you, Dennis. Rebecca? what do you make of all of this? From the
oh dear, do I have the magic wand?
From outside of the bubble, how does this look like?
Well, I didn't get a chance to kind of.
Mic.
I didn't get a chance to
closer.
Follow, reflect on the commons literature, especially the one led by Eleanor Ostrom. I'm not quite sure how many of the participants today know about her work.
Awesome work from Eleanor Ostrom.
Yes, she's the first female laureate receiving
Nobel
that
laureate.
honor. And her ideas of exploring alternative governance model beyond the market and the state, or the idea of autonomous governance that she articulated in her 1990s book, Governing the Commons. I think there's a lot of inspiration and
absolutely
a useful mechanism that we could draw from there. And so kind of wanted to also clarify the idea of the public interest in the public. It's not necessarily the government. I think we are talking about civil society as a whole. And if the overarching concept or value that we are driving toward is something that's shared, such as like the common heritage kind of idea, then each one of us is a stakeholder. However, if I draw from my experience working with indigenous populations, those communities are technical communities as well, because they have the valuable know-how and knowledge about managing the ecosystem and biodiversity and so on. Even though the policymaking community value their know-how and so on, but in the real world, they are disadvantaged in many ways, economically, socially, and culturally, and so on and so forth. But coming back to the cyberspace, most of the communities in this space is so privileged. If I ask who are the vulnerable groups and who are you trying to protect, maybe it's more a competition and power struggle than saying who is actually or something is actually so vulnerable that we have to protect it, or it has such an intrinsic value that we place on them. Just some perspective that I wanted to bring.
Who are the victims or the vulnerable groups there, and also who are you trying to protect, as you mentioned? Bill, and then I will let Akinori ground this to some of the questions raised, and then Madeline to close the panel, if that's okay.
Okay, well, so just further to what I said already, by way of summary, I think if the idea is that we are interested in knowing whether governments can, on a multilateral basis, agree frameworks that positively protect the public core, and the public core includes networks and services, that you are drawn directly into the realm of international telecom policy, where for 30 years, a set of governments have been pushing to say that the internet should be completely regulated under international telecom law, with all the rules and procedures set by those conventions and treaties applied to the internet. If we had done that, you would not have the internet of today. You would not have any of the systems, you would not have the growth, you wouldn't have any of it. So I think one has to be careful. There was a reason why at the World Conference on International Telecom in 2012 in Dubai, when they tried to revise this treaty, telecom regulation treaty, and the proposal was there for the internet to be fully covered by the treaty, the entire industrialized democracy world left and did not sign.
Walk out. Yep.
So there's a reason.
Akinori.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the. I'm not meant to add, but I am joining the Anriette for the African situation, and still we have some vulnerable system in the technical communities, institutions, and then we only to improve that. We only to reinforce our own mechanism. For the greater confidence on our own system, and then which can be quite trusted by the multilateral community. That's maybe great point of technical committee side. And then with that, we can trust that multilateral community in return. That's my point. Very good discussion. Thank you very much for that.
Madeline.
Thank you, Pablo, and thanks everyone. What a fascinating discussion. I think we achieved our goal today of opening this dialogue. As I said, we weren't looking for an answer, but we were looking for a great discussion, and I think we have definitely had that. The central point that we began with was whether there could be positive protective measures put in place to protect the public core, and whether states could play a role there. If so, what shape or form might that take? Now, I think we could all agree that governance of internet resources has been remarkably successful through the multi-stakeholder model. It's held as an exemplar, and it's really quite incredible when we look back over the last kind of, I guess, 40, 50 years. What's happened it has been remarkable, but that largely comes from a technical community, and those technical decisions do have significant societal, commercial, and political implications, and that makes that, of course, an issue that states do and will care about. I think what this comes down to, the conversation that we've had, it comes down to this question of who we regard as, what we regard as responsible behavior, and who we see as responsible actors, as legitimate actors. And Anriette touched on this really, really nicely, I think, when she said that legitimacy is a product of responsible behavior, and that is certainly one way of looking at legitimacy. But then what about these situations like Afrinic, where those multi-stakeholder actors that are considered as responsible and legitimate act in an irresponsible manner in the context of extremely powerful private actors? How do we balance that role of the state and the expectations of civil society, those expectations of restraint and proactivity by governance? And I think this is particularly important for smaller, less powerful states who are outside of that power dynamic that has really driven multi-stakeholder internet governance so far. Manju made a very, very interesting point in one of our planning sessions about, and because we're in Taiwan, let's bring it back to Taiwan, about the challenges that Taiwan in particular faces in participating fully in a multi-stakeholder community. And so balancing that, even at capacity for some states to really fully partake of that community with the obligations that states face. I liked Rebecca's point, was so valuable. We do face these same challenges in other fields of protecting. What are we protecting and for whom? And I think that the answers that we give to that question tell a lot about how we see the world, less about governance and more about our view of the world. We're not advocating here for one view or the other, but we do feel that it's critical that we can have these discussions in an open manner, because we have a long history that we're building on, but we have to be able to think about how things are developing, what new risks, as Bill pointed out, what opportunities there are, and what type of governance will best take us through that period. Just in closing, Anriette talked about, bringing this back to how we strengthen our governance mechanisms. And perhaps that's the central question. We're asking here, if states have a role in supporting the protection of the public core, not in governing it, not in taking over the administration of it, and not in transforming it, but in supporting strong, legitimate, responsible, multi-stakeholder, the community that already exists that to protect it. And I think that question has not been bottomed out yet. And I think we have more work to do on that, but I think we made a fantastic start today. So thanks again to Pablo for coordinating, and for everyone who spoke, including the questions from the floor.
Thank you so much for the warm hospitality here in TWIGF. I hope this was a good contribution to the debate locally, regionally, and globally. And thank you all that attended and resisted during the coffee break. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.